My name is Victor Coelho. I'm the Associate Provost for Undergraduate Education and a Professor of Music. And together with David Eckel, Director of the Core Curriculum and Professor of Religion, we have organized this fascinating event. I know it will be fascinating, on the future of the book. The title, of course, is not new. If there are many versions of the future of the book over the past 15 to 20 years, as we have come into a historical fold, very much like what people experienced in the end of the 15th century, and certainly by the beginning of the 16th, when traditions of reading, authorship, accessibility, formats, and technology all placed a new perspective on books, publishing, reading, and learning, fundamentally knowledge. And so those historical points will also be used today to frame this mini conference. On the one hand, we have voices from an age that is still about to appear, and that's the digital age of publishing, the digital age of books, the digital age really of how knowledge is disseminated. At the other end of the spectrum, Anne Blair, a MacArthur Fellow and historian from Harvard, will be speaking about textbooks and note-taking in the Renaissance at a time when manuscript traditions were quickly being overwhelmed by print culture during the 16th century, with the same kinds of critics and the same kinds of advocates that we see today as the embracing of both technologies, printing being a technology and the digital printing obviously being a technology, as both of those are now with us at exactly the right moment. We are probably at some sort of tipping point, and I think this is fairly obvious to most of us who are involved with books, and we all are. We see tremendous advantages and disadvantages at both levels. We are in a position now where we have to look very carefully at how libraries and how readerships are formed. We are looking at the economies of the situation, at the sustainable green elements of the situation, and we're looking at the large-scale accessibility and how even epistemologically we are viewing a fundamental change in how we learn. So this is the framework for the conference today, and I just wanted to perhaps give that large overview because a number of aspects about these topics will be covered in various dimensions. And my own work is in the early 16th century, and it's exactly the time when music publishing takes place. 1500 is the year when we have the first printed books of music. And immediately, one can look at what takes place in that people suddenly have access to music, and musical styles change as a result of that access. We also have arrangements as people take church music and arrange them for secular domestic formats, completely changing the context. We have the people who are now marketing books to university towns like Padua and Pavia, looking at what students are willing to buy, so even tastes are being changed. And then books start to be collected as well. And I bring up music because the future of the book is really not just about the book. What we are also talking about is the future of many, many things that are also in this web of change, particularly digital media that encompasses not just books and text, but audio and visual files. And so all of these things are now in a rapid state of change. And there'll be a lot of time for questions during this time. And as you start to think about these, we are going to open up the mic so people can come up here and ask your question. And the reason we're asking people to come here is because we're videotaping. But if you are bashful in any sense, you can send an email to apue@bu.edu from your laptop or your cell phone. APUE, Associate Provost for Undergraduate Education. APUE, APU, like The Simpsons. APU, it's me, I send a quickie email, right? But I send an email to apue at bu.edu. I'll pick it up on my some mobile device that I have, and that way your question will be logged and queued up and answered. Okay, so I'm now going to turn the podium over to my colleague and friend, Professor David Eckel, whom you all know, and who is the co-organizer of this event. In fact, had the original idea, and the fact that we were able to organize this in about 2 weeks, I think, is a tribute to both your staff, you, and the entire core curriculum. So, thank you very much. David Eckel will introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victor, and thanks to all of you for coming and be part of this event. We did announce it just a few days ago, and we're so glad that so many of you were able to come and experience this with us. I have to tell you, just to start with, how this idea came about, and actually has a little bit more of a history than just the last couple of weeks. You know, if you are professors, and I think many of you in the room are, that there is a certain kind of appointment that students make with you that just has the feeling of being an official appointment. You know that they're going to come to you to confront you about something terribly significant, and they walk in a little stiffly, usually wearing better clothes than they normally do, and they sit down in the chair and they fold their hands in their lap and they begin to state their business. One of the best appointments like this I ever had was with a young Sikh student who wanted to tell me how important it was to study Sikhism at BU. And that turned out to be wonderful and led to many great things. But more recently, a student came into my office and said, "Professor Eckel, in the core curriculum, would you consider the adoption of electronic books?" More or less like that. And I nodded and I said, "If you would like to use electronic books, it's totally fine with me, but we hope that you will use the same translation that we're using in class, and we hope very much that when you do that, you will consider the beauty and the significance also of the printed text." So I gave her a rather ambiguous response, and I think that ambiguity still sits with me. I'm not sure how I feel about the advent of electronic books, especially in a great books course like our core curriculum, but I think it's very valuable for us together to think about the future of the book. It has a lot to do with our pedagogy, with our identities as scholars and students, and is just simply well worth discussing. What is the role of the book in the core curriculum? What is the role of the book in the humanities or in our intellectual life more generally? We're eager to start a conversation about this question with anyone who wants to talk, especially with the students, with you who are students in the audience, because you are the ones who will, in so many ways, lead us into the new technology that's bubbling all around us, but also with schools of education, with cognitive scientists who can help us understand the processes of attention that make learning possible electronically and with the physical book, with the law school, where issues of intellectual property come so dramatically into play when we talk about books, with the librarians who I see as I look around are here amongst us. I hope very much that this will be the beginning of a much longer conversation here at BU about the future of the book in our own intellectual community and in the world more widely. So that's the intention that lies behind this conversation this afternoon. Now, why did it happen right now? Why did we start this conversation today? In part because there was an article in the Boston Globe just about 3 or 4 weeks ago about a shocking development at Cushing Academy. It was led by our good friend, James Tracy, who has been the headmaster at Boston University Academy, recently moved to be headmaster at Cushing Academy. At Cushing, under Jim Tracy's leadership, they decided to do away with the books in the library and replace the books with computer screens and a coffee bar. Am I right about that, Jim? You'll tell us more. This became a topic of animated discussion on the web and in intellectual circles here in Boston. And it seemed to me, because Jim has such a strong BU connection, that it would be great to get him to speak to us to start this conversation in motion. So Professor Tracy, Dr. Tracy will speak to us about his experience at Cushing Academy, and then we'll take a few minutes for questions. I know that many of you will want to converse with him about his experiences. And then Professor Christopher Ricks of the Editorial Institute and the core curriculum will offer some remarks in response. That will be the order of our presentations this afternoon. So Jim, thanks so much for joining us. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. James Tracy of Cushing Academy.
Thanks, David. Can I move this by any chance? Can I, or at least close it? Great. Thank you, David. Nice to see you all. I brought 5 books, since this is about the future of the book. I brought 5 books. I couldn't fit them all in my backpack, just 4 of them. I thought I'd just share them. Well, again, nice to see you all. I wanted to bring 5 books to share with you. Well, they're kind of in the way. Excuse me. I also brought another 1,000 books that I wanted to share with you. What did I do with them? Brought another 1,000 here. You know, I think I'll download the entire works of Aristotle. There it is. Just downloaded the entire works of Aristotle, so now it's 1,001 books. It's nice to do that when you're in your armchair at home. Cost me 99 cents from Amazon. Well, it's nice to be back at Boston University. BU is an educational home for me that is very dear to me. I have many good friends here. I worked here for 6 years and enjoyed every moment of it. I also have 2 graduate degrees from Boston University, so I am a double terrier. When I was at Boston University, I reported in 6 years to 4.5 presidents. And I have enormous regard for Bob Brown, who was the last to whom I reported. I believe he has brought the vision, stability, and character to really bring Boston University to new heights, building, of course, on the shoulders of giants. I'm very, very proud to count David Eckel among my colleagues. David is the most gentlemanly of scholars and the most scholarly of gentlemen I have had the privilege to know. And it's indeed an honor to have as my interlocutor Christopher Ricks, who is one of the finest minds alive. We live in a time of extraordinary change, as Victor was referencing. I would suggest that we can think in terms, just for today's discussion, of 3 major changes that have completely transformed every dimension of human life. I would submit to you that the first was the Neolithic, which took thousands of years to really come about in terms of its full expression, and gave us settled agriculture, urbanization, and urbanity, the hallmarks of civilization. The second one played out over about 400 to 500 years. I would say it began about 1500, and I would conflate early capitalist formation with later agricultural and industrial revolutions. So I would say that this was a mode of production, if you will. I'm not a Marxist, but I think that we could use some of those categories of analysis to suggest that there was some sort of capitalist industrial formation from 1500 to the late 20th century that we know completely revolutionized everything about prior human society. And we are about 20 years into the next major revolution that's going to play out in decades, and not in centuries, not in millennia. I call that the bio, info, and nano revolution. And I'll return to that. Another way to think about this, but notice the acceleration of change. Notice the time frames within which we were looking at those logarithmic changes. I would also submit to you that we can think about it from an information perspective. It's a tremendous endeavor for humans to compile information that they can pass on to the next generation, to have intergenerational transfer and accumulation of knowledge. We have 3-pound brains that were really, as Martin Rees once said to me over dinner, it's amazing that we have these 3-pound brains that really evolved for us to survive on the Serengeti, that have gotten us to the point of even questioning quantum physics, whether we actually ever understand it. And so our brains are really quite limited, and they've brought us quite far. We're also limited by the fact that we have a very short human lifespan. And so it's an amazing accomplishment that we as a species have been able to accumulate knowledge and then share it so that it can be accumulated intergenerationally. And it takes an enormous amount of effort to preserve and impart that. We were mostly verbal in our transfer throughout most of human history, hundreds of thousands of years. And then, of course, was the invention of writing about 5,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. And so if you think about the accumulation of knowledge, it was relatively, or functionally flat for hundreds of thousands of years. And then you have this significant uptick with the emergence of writing just 5,000 years ago. So hundreds of thousands of years of very episodic and fairly flat accumulation of information, then this tremendous uptick with the invention of writing. And then a significant uptick thereafter with the invention and actual proper utilization, I should say, of movable type in Europe in the 15th century. And so we then see this tremendous revolution in human relations and thought, epistemology, ideation, social relations. Without the invention of the movable type, it's hard to conceive of the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, modern democratic movements. So it's a profound increase in the accumulation of information with that uptick, and also a profound democratization at that stage of information. Today we're living in what I believe is going to be the most profound change in the entire history of humanity since our inception. It's not only a tremendous explosion of information that starts to look virtually vertical. It might be an S-curve. It's certainly going to reach its limits. It's hard to imagine that you could have more information than the number of particles in the universe, so there are some discernible limits to how far we can go. But we're so far from those limits, and the explosion is so rapid and accelerating. And that's a very important piece of this, of understanding our time. It is accelerating, Moore's law and other indications, so that it's virtually vertical for all intents and purposes for those of us living through it in terms of the explosion of information. And incidentally, the print medium cannot possibly keep up with that explosion of information through which we're living. And so by definition, the print medium becomes less and less comprehensive of the accumulation of human knowledge and information every single day. In fact, it's become less comprehensive since I began my talk. Now, let me just look at some of the aspects of this change in my own lifetime. I remember watching an MIT computer professor in, as I recall, it was 1982 on what was then the McNeil-Lehrer report, saying that these new desktop computers are not going to be really of much use to the average person because nobody can really at home make use of 800,000 bytes of information. If you think about the scale of reduction of cost and miniaturization, it is quite striking. To take a very recent example, we could certainly go back to 1945 and look at the emergence of computing, but just to take a recent example, we have the Human Genome Project that reached its first draft in 2000. Well, as late as 1996, Lee Silver, who is a brilliant and, for me, a germinal thinker in the field of genetics at Princeton University, he said in 1996, we're at least 10 years away from the first mapping of a human genome. Well, he was wrong by 6 years in a 10-year prediction. By the year 2000, we had a human genome, and that's mostly an information challenge. But it is an example of how there is this blurring of boundaries. You have the biological, in this case, and the informational challenges. And one of the hallmarks of today's transformation of the bio, nano, and info revolutions is that they are converging and blurring their boundaries and mutually reinforcing. But I would submit to you that that the human genome was principally an information challenge. It cost $1 billion to map the very first human genome. In 2009, as we sit here today, it would cost under $1,000 to map any one of our human genomes. In a 9-year period, the reduction in cost has been on a scale of 1,000,000 to 1 in 9 years. So for those of us who say to Cushing Academy, well, you're just privileged and affluent and you can afford to do this, but what you're doing is not germane to other schools that are underfunded, I say that's so much stuff and nonsense. All of this technology is going to be of negligible cost in a handful of years. So technology and information are accelerating, converging, mutually reinforcing, and blurring of boundaries. 40 years ago, who would have predicted that today, 40 years ago, when the first human walked on the moon, that we would today be carrying cell phones, that the computer in my pocket would be far more powerful than the computer on the lunar landing module, that we would have CAT scans and MRIs that can do profound diagnostics without any invasive opening of skin or so forth, that we would have cloning, that we would have transgenic species. Right down the street in Framingham, Massachusetts, the FDA approved for a company that's based there the first human-animal transgenic species pharmaceutical. Okay, so there are goats here in Massachusetts that belong to that firm that have human genomes implanted into the goat genomes. I might be wrong, but if memory serves, it's 40% human. And their milk secretes human protein that can then be used as an anti-clotting pharmaceutical. It's harvested. And if you want to produce more of that, you just breed more of those goats. It's also possible, by the way, if you have multiple pharmaceuticals from a herd of transgenic goats, to genetically alter them so that their milk is different colors so you won't confuse the pharmaceuticals. Now that's an unprecedented ethical consideration when you ask a group of students if just a few miles from here there are goats that they can eat because they're part human. That's a brave new world for these students. It's a world that's today, it's not future. We're talking about today. That would have been inconceivable 40 years ago, as well as the internet, the changes in your jobs, globalization, and so forth. With the acceleration of change, what world are our students going to inhabit 40 years hence? I take that very seriously because I think that it has the potential to lead us to what will be the most transformative liminal moment in the history of our species since we first emerged. And so I would submit to you that the 21st century may be the Mephistophelian century of our species, where we decide whether we are more interested in a will to power and a path of destructiveness or cooperativeness and success as a species. We will cure every imaginable disease in this century if we do it right. A handful of people will destroy civilization as we know it with bioterrorism or by other means if we do it wrong. This is the make or break century, as James Martin said. And we feel at Cushing Academy that there is a moral imperative then to think about how we can educate students to make this a successful century for the species. We really do feel that it is that profound an endeavor. And it's that which has driven us to be so much of our own internal disruptor pedagogically, and also to try to be a beta tester, if you will, for what is possible in schools going forward. We know that it is bold, we know that it is controversial, but we feel that it is imperative that some school step forward and say, we will explore all the possibilities of how we can optimally educate students so that they can be humane, humanizing, and successful agents of change in the world of 2050. As I said, it's a brave new world, but let's remember that that itself has two different aspects to it. Certainly the Huxley version of dystopia, but it also is the phrase that was on the lips of Miranda in Shakespeare's Tempest. And for Miranda, it was a brave new world of remarkable and beautiful possibilities. Cushing Academy is a coeducational, mostly boarding school for grades 9 through 12, nestled in a very pastoral setting in central Massachusetts. We have students from 28 countries. And really built into the DNA of Cushing Academy is a boldness and a willingness to embrace future possibilities. We were the first coeducational boarding school in the United States. We became coeducational in 1865, more than a century before most other schools. And we were called immoral for many decades by many people for that. I know that one of the early headmasters was very concerned that students walking in to promenading into a gathering together coeducationally might veer over into something that might be construed as sashaying, which would be quite disturbing for our rather sketchy reputation already. We also were one of the first movers in embracing foreign students as a part of our boarding school community back in the 1920s, as well as other types of diversity, certainly domestically. Our student body president in the 1920s included an African-American young woman. We now count among our alumni students from 193 countries, some of which no longer exist. And we were one of the first schools, before it was even defined, to embrace learning differences. Back in the 1940s and 50s, we built programs for dyslexia and other types of learning differences before it was even a working definition. And today, 20% of our student body is in that program. Now, Cushing, as I said, decided that we would, as a school, embrace the possibilities for educating students for the future. We felt that that would be a powerful experience for our own students in terms of being exposed to the cutting-edge megatrends of their age. And also, we were determined that everything that we discovered, whether it worked or didn't work from our own experiments, would be shared as freeware for any school in the world that wants to know, as deeply as they wish to know, what we have been exploring. And so we are purposely positioning ourselves to share everything that we have with anybody who wishes it, and with no proprietorship. Now, we went through a strategic process that I won't burden you with, but suffice to say that we went through a 6-month strategic process to come to this conclusion that included a great deal of self-education as a community. And in the end, we, 2.5 years ago, embarked on this journey with a unanimous vote of the faculty and the unanimous vote of the trustees. And we are aided in that endeavor by some very forward-thinking leaders. The president-elect and then trustee, now president-elect, of our board of trustees is Dick Harrington. Dick Harrington is the recently retired CEO of Thompson Reuters Corporation. He, in 20 years at the helm of Thompson, brought it from the largest print publisher of textbooks in the world to a corporation that is now global in its operations, that is 90% electronic. He, in fact, was introduced at Harvard Business School by a professor who said, Dick Harrington is the smartest newspaper owner I know. And Dick got up to the podium and said, thanks for the introduction, but I don't know what you're talking about. When I took over Thompson, I sold 100 newspapers. We got out of newspapers. And the professor said, exactly. By the time he left Thompson, it was and is 90% electronic, and his last major feat as head of Thompson was to purchase Reuters for $17 billion to create a global corporation that is maybe the largest purveyor of information electronically in the world today. And so we have great input on a daily basis almost from Dick Harrington. We also have a board of advisors who include James Martin, Pat Bassett. Pat Bassett is the president of the National Association of Independent Schools, representing over 1,200 private schools around the country. Brock Reeve, who is the head of the Stem Cell Institute at Harvard University. Now, I mentioned James Martin. Jim gave the largest gift in the history of British education to Oxford University a few years ago. He is considered one of the greatest software developers in history and has written over 100 books on technology and future society, including the Wired Society, with which you may be familiar, and most recently, the Meaning of the 21st Century. Jim is on our advisory board and has been a great mentor to the entire Cushing Academy community. But as I mentioned, he did give the largest gift in the history of British education to Oxford to found the 21st Century School at Oxford, where they now have 80 researchers working full-time on megatrends into the 21st century. And so as a key part of the Cushing Initiative, we became the first secondary school in the world, the only at this point, to have a formal affiliation with Oxford University, specifically and most closely with the 21st Century School there. We have a whole series of curricular discussions and innovations, but the basic work is to take the deep research of the Oxford scholars who are working on megatrends, translate that into secondary level curricula, and then give it away for free on the web and elsewhere for anybody who wishes to utilize them. So it's kind of using a secondary school to translate the cutting edge research of Oxford professors in everything from energy futures to existential threats to human survival and all things in between into secondary level curricula that can then be disseminated around the world. And we're looking at also partnering with other secondary level programs around the world, including American inner city schools, public schools, and we're exploring the possibility of working with the entire educational program of the University of Bhutan in the Himalayas, because the king there is a Cushing alumnus as well as an Oxford alumnus, and it looks as though we might be able to do some interesting things there. We have many, many programs. Maddie Goodwin, who came to us from Boston University, has established dozens of programs that go down to the deepest level of meta-educational discourse in our core curriculum. We are looking at every single aspect of everything we do in the classroom to ask, what is the optimal way to prepare students for the world they are going to inhabit to the best of our ability? We're looking at skill sets. Some of them are traditional skill sets that need to be recentered and re-emphasized, such as critical thinking. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We also are looking at new skill sets or traditional skill sets that need to be centered in new ways, such as bias evaluation, data mining, and so forth. And the library is germane to that because one of the discussions that led to this decision about the library was to move our entire curriculum from the 19th century assumption that information is difficult to acquire, difficult to garner from printed books on stacks, to the realization that today information is ubiquitous and enormously abundant. And so what we need to teach the students is not how to garner information, but how to delineate that which is wheat from the chaff. We also, interestingly, I think, I could mention many, many programs, but one I'll focus on is the fact that we have an Oxford Scholar in residence every semester, each fall and spring. And that scholar comes and spends a week teaching in classes throughout the academy, but also every afternoon working with a selected group of students and teachers to share with them their fundamental research concerns and conclusions. And then toward the end of that week, the entire group of students and teachers and Oxford researcher then try to think about how could we most engagingly and efficaciously communicate this to other secondary students anywhere in the world. And they have the full support of our IT department to create a video or a website or a syllabus or whatever their need is, and then we give it away as freeware on the web. A culminating moment of that week then is when the researcher is on a panel discussion moderated by me with other researchers in the same field, and we speak to and with and interact with the entire school, the entire Cushing Academy community, and it's really another way of translating into the secondary level what the researchers are about, and then we give that video away to anybody who's interested. We have had Nick Bostrom, Juan Enriquez, Joel Garrow. Most recently, we had George Leeson with us a couple of weeks ago, who's heading up a number of demographic studies on aging globally at Oxford University and Copenhagen. And on the panel, too, was Aubrey de Grey, who's taking a different take on things. So it gives you some sense. What I'm trying to convey is that we have committed ourselves in our very sinews to this endeavor. And it's a much broader construct, much, much broader construct than a decision about a library, which truly was a rather incidental, logical, and natural discussion and conclusion within our program that we never thought would get the wildfire of interest that it has. So let's talk about our library and what we're actually doing there. Cushing Academy, in my estimation, is the only mainstream educational institution, at least of which I am aware, at any level, that has committed itself wholeheartedly to engage in deep meta-educational examination of how to optimally educate children for this brave new world. And so the library, we understood, was an experiment. We really are committed to doing reconnaissance of the near future for other schools, if you will. And so we purposely leapfrogged ahead and said, what is the logical next step of reading? Specifically, research. Now, we really need to not be monolithic here. We need to delineate some categories. There's a lot of monolithic thinking in the reactions to what we're doing, which I find quite striking. Even Robert Darnton, at the end of his very engaging piece, seemed to be saying, well, we need all libraries as citadels of learning to be there in case we, well, for many reasons. He lists about 8 or 9. Well, all libraries? Not all libraries are created equally. I mean, yes, we have to preserve Widener. Yes, we have to preserve the Bodleian Library and the Library of Congress. And of course we will as a print repository. But little old Cushing's high school library, I don't think that's in the same category. That's a purely utilitarian functional library for high school students to do little 5-page research papers on marine biology or whatever it might be. And so it's a very different decision to determine what is the best way to provide them with the resources they need to do their little research papers with basically generalized and mostly outdated books on the shelves in this little library than it is to determine the future course of the book. And so I would really encourage us to think in multiple ways about this and to have some nuance. Now, we said to ourselves in making this decision, our students are already, as Mark Prensky notes, digital natives. They completely inhabit this world. And those of us of my age, older, and even younger, and I would even submit that some of the undergraduates in this audience are already over the hill as far as being digital natives compared to the students who are coming along behind you. We are immigrants to this world. And so one of the things that we're discussing quite robustly at Cushing is how do you build the pedagogical model where we cede to the students the authority over the technological medium by which they learn? We no longer are the authorities in the classroom over that. And yet we have other types of content authority that quite legitimates our presence in the classroom. But that's a different type of pedagogical dynamic, and we are exploring what that might mean, recognizing that we are immigrants to that technology and they are natives. They told us in no uncertain terms that they really didn't use the printed books very much that were in the library. We had 20,000 books in the library. Incidentally, I got 2 master's degrees at Boston University. I never opened a printed book. I did everything with the tremendous resources that were available online for all of my research projects. And I think I did fairly well. The students also need new skills. Instead of telling them to continue to go into this archaic these archaic library stacks to mine information from that, they actually can go at the touch of a button and access hundreds and thousands of resources, and what they need from us is for us to teach them what is reliable and what is not. We also found that they were tending to go to Wikipedia or tending to go to blogs and so forth that we consider quite unreliable. So we decided, let's spend the money that we're already spending on replenishing the books that they're not using in any significant way, to buy into databases that will provide them with, at the click of a button, peer-reviewed journal articles in the hundreds of thousands, and teach them how to delineate that which is perhaps more reliable from things that they are already familiar with on the internet. One of my historical axioms is that we can't alter megatrends, try as we might, but we can influence some of the detailed implications of historical megatrends. And I would submit to you that one megatrend that is quite clear is that books are doomed as the key repositories of information. Now, when that will reach the critical mass, I don't know. I think it's going to be in the next 15 years or so. But in the long run, by the end of the century, books will no longer be the key repositories of information. If I wanted to be quite bold, I would submit to you that they already are surpassed. Now, what does that mean in terms of libraries? Well, we decided that we would quite clearly move to emphasizing investing in the electronic media for our students and not in the print medium, for all the reasons I've suggested, including as a beta tester of the future for other schools. We would just jump ahead, go to the logical next step, and see what we could do. See what the results were and share them with others. We have positioned ourselves in that way strategically. We also feel very profoundly that if we are successful at this, that we are helping to shape the way for the poorest and most underfunded students in the world to be able to access the largest repository of human information ever compiled. And I'll share with you at the end in just a moment why that is. Now, in terms of printed versus electronic, I would point out a few things. Again, we don't want to be monolithic. I would delineate out very clearly research use of books from pleasure and depth reading of books. Okay? Now, in terms of books as research tools, they are already surpassed. When I was at Stanford University doing my doctoral work, I would go into the 3 million volume library at Green, and it would take me sometimes an entire hour to find the location of a particular book on a shelf in some annex. And I would get there to find half the time that it wasn't on the shelf, or was improperly placed, and I couldn't find it. Now, I can provide my students at Cushing millions of electronic books, and they are books just the same as any other book, just a different delivery system. And they always are on the shelf, they're never taken out, and they can do things that you can't possibly do in a multi-million volume library as a doctoral student. I can search 5 million books simultaneously for all references to the Gadsden purchase. It would take me years to do that in Green Library at Stanford. And so there are tremendous tools that come with electronic research methods, and they're continually updated. I can search hundreds of thousands of peer-reviewed journals instantaneously and come up with all peer-reviewed full-text journals that are germane to my topic. So I would submit to you that in terms of research, and that was the sole aspect of our decision, the research library. How would students do their research for their papers? We went instantaneously from 20,000 books to millions of books that students can search. And I think that's what the headline should be. Private school in Massachusetts expands its library from 20,000 to 5 million books. And that library is ubiquitous on campus. We have for 5 years been a laptop school. Financial aid students get a free laptop that we maintain for them. So every single student goes to every single classroom with a laptop. The entire campus is Wi-Fi. So now the library becomes ubiquitous itself. They can be sitting under a tree and be searching 5 million titles. Okay? So then the discussion for us shifted to, well, what's the purpose of the physical library? Will it just disappear in the future? Will librarians just be in an office somewhere, go into the classrooms to the smart boards, and incidentally, every classroom at Cushing has a smart board, so you can access the entire internet and also intranet and resources of our library in every classroom with the push of a button on the wall. So now the librarian can go into the classroom and bring with her or him 5 million books. Bring the entire library in their pocket, if you will, everywhere they go to work with classes. So why do you need a library? Well, in order to try to ironically save libraries from irrelevance in the future, we decided to spend about $400,000 that we didn't have to spend to explore what might be possible in terms of creating a new type of learning commons, a new agora, so that there can be an exchange of ideas in informal settings with teachers and students in a meaningful way with the entire information of civilization at their fingertips. And so that's why we spent about $400,000 transforming our library. I even sent 2 of my key administrators all the way to California to take a tour of the Googleplex to see what types of learning and interactive environments they're creating there, see if there was anything germane for what could be the future type of learning commons at a school. We did not make a decision about depth reading, pleasure reading, or classroom assignments. It's still completely up to the classroom teacher as to whether they use print books or electronic books. Most of them are still using print books. But I think that will change over time, actually. I would submit to you that in terms of pleasure reading or depth reading, the technology has not yet surpassed the printed book. I think that will change. I love my Kindle for some of the reasons I already showed you. I also find it very intuitive and comfortable to read. And I'm reading more than ever before. I'm averaging about 2 books a week now, despite my busy schedule. And this comes on the plane with me. I would submit to you that there are some downsides to the Kindle compared to the printed book and vice versa. I almost liken it to the time when the horse and the automobile both had their virtues. And were pretty much, it was 50-50. The difference being that the horse wasn't improving. The automobile was, and soon surpassed the horse. And I think that there's no question in my mind that we are soon going to surpass the printed book in terms of the conviviality of electronic reading, as well as its other virtues, such as its miniaturization, ready accessibility, and so forth. I envision even holographic projections of books so that you can have, if you want it to look like a codex, you can make it look like a codex and flip the pages virtually and so forth. I think there are going to be all sorts of technologies in terms of making it start to replicate the experience that we have with printed books. But I also think that the new generation will not share our nostalgia for the printed book at all. And so printed books will really become less and less relevant. For pleasure reading, I mean. Now, there are certainly reasons why scholars will want printed books. There are certainly reasons why we don't want to eliminate the repositories of printed books any more than we want to eliminate the repositories of illuminated manuscripts from medieval times. They will be precious to us, and we will preserve them. But why do we have to preserve them at every single little gathering of books in every campus around the world? Well, we won't. And the financials will not make sense for that to be done, to have these vast warehouses of books. It took an entire huge room just to house 20,000 books at little old Cushing Academy. And I guarantee you that Boston University will not consider it financially viable by the end of this century to have multi-million volume shelved books. Now, there are some concerns that have come up, and I'll touch on those briefly to end. Are we techno utopians? No, we are not. I share much of the ambivalence that David referenced. But what I am convinced of is that there is an inexorability to the trends that we are examining, and that what we want to do is get out ahead of them as a school, as an admittedly bold and experimental school, get out ahead of them and see if we can't find models that can shape the many contingencies of these new technological transformations toward humane and humanizing outcomes at this critical liminal moment in human history. And to that end, we are trying to have an influence on contingency. So we are not techno-utopians. And in fact, I've spent a lot of time the last few years hanging out with a lot of technologists and scientists, some of them the finest in the world. And one of the things that bothers me is that they don't have the scaffolding of a broad humanistic education. It's imperative that humanists get into this debate in profound and direct ways. When I hear a scientist who's a Nobel laureate saying, well, yes, technology cuts both ways, as we know from Star Trek, I think, well, that's a pretty superficial reference point. I would be much more heartened if they were thinking in terms of Goethe. Then they might have a more sober assessment and appraisal of human fallibility and possibility. The aesthetics, some say, of printed books are lost. I've already addressed that, but I don't think that our generation, my generation, appreciates the aesthetics and the serendipity of web surfing either. Why do we privilege one experience over another? There are some who say that what we're doing is just going to be outdated soon itself. There's one person who keeps getting referenced in all the newspapers around the country in response to Cushing saying, well, they're going to get stuck with this old technology. I have floppy disks in my drawer. And I think, who the hell has floppy disks in their drawer today? I sure don't. I kept upgrading. Cushing budgets for a 3-year generation in its IT. So every 3 years, we upgrade our technology. I'm wondering if this guy drives around trying to shove his 8-track tapes into his iPod outlet. Just some silliness that's coming back at us. Some people say, well, only 65% of contemporary printed books are available electronically. Well, when we had 20,000 mostly outdated books, we had less than 0.5% of all the available books. We went from 0.5% to 65% in one shot. I think that's pretty good. And what do we do if the student wants a book that isn't available electronically? Well, that's unlikely, first of all. Let's remember, we're not Boston University. We have students who come in and say, I have to do a paper on the Gadsden Purchase. What do you got? They rarely come in and say, I need that compelling monograph that was written in 1985 about the Gadsden Purchase. So we have to keep in mind the purposes for which we're talking. And if the student does need something that is unavailable electronically, well, we will buy the damn thing. We're not monolithic. I'll skip some of the other silly comments that I've received repeatedly, such as, what if the electricity goes off? Which comes up all the time. But I think one of the most germane points is that of wealth and privilege. And I do want to address that head on, because I think that, yes, we are a privileged, affluent school, and so we can afford to be early adopters. We're also privileged compared to public schools because we are not heavily regulated in any way compared to public schools by the federal or local or state governments. And so we can be quite supple in our experimentation. So in that sense, we're privileged. But everything we're doing is designed with a sense that it is imperative that we start to have a leavening of education and a transformation of education for the betterment of all of us. We're all safer if we start to have new modes of education that are humane and humanizing, ethically centered, but also preparing students for the changes that they are going to experience in their lifetimes. And with the cheapening of technology in terms of cost, I am actually propelled by this profound vision. You know, I was a high school dropout, and an epiphany for me occurred one day when I was 18 years old. I was married to my current lovely wife, 31 years together now. I was married with a young child, and I went to the beach with them on a Sunday, or Saturday, I guess it was. And for some reason at that time, I was working in a factory at the time, high school dropout. I grew very frustrated that there were all these myriad gradations of the color blue in the sky and in the sea, but I had no lexicon to reference them except to say light blue, dark blue. And so I asked Jen to watch our son, and I drove to a local bookstore, came back with a thesaurus, opened it up, saw next to blue words like azure and cerulean and so forth, and I still didn't know exactly what shades these referenced, but for the first time in my life, because of this book, I felt that the entire English language was my birthright. That was one of the most profound epiphanies of my life. I got my GED, worked my way through college at UMass Boston while working in a factory, and eventually went on. I believe that there's tremendous talent out there that is not getting sufficient access to knowledge and learning, and that precisely what we're doing at Cushing and elsewhere, at BU and elsewhere, is going to put into the hands of every child in the world, very soon, all the information of human knowledge. That what's electronic is rapidly becoming coterminal with all of human knowledge and will reach that point in X number of years. And that it will be protean in the sense that somebody in Malawi will be able to turn that into their native language at the click of a button as well. I wanted to share with you a story about Srinivasa Ramanujan. If you're not familiar with him, he was early 20th century mathematician, born to a lower middle class family in India. And he was lucky in that he was lower middle class, so he did happen upon a basic introductory algebra book as a teenager and taught himself from that book. And then he got a very spotty education, had to drop out for financial reasons after a year in a very poor college. He sent a letter to G.H. Hardy at one point, and Hardy recognized that this was either an enormous crank or a letter of tremendous genius, because what he had provided Hardy was a series of theorems that he had thought up based upon his rudimentary knowledge of math. And most of them were theorems that had already been discovered, and he was providing them in an idiosyncratic way. But Hardy realized this is probably a genius, brought him to England, and scholars today are still working out the implications of Ramanujan's theorems. Now, he was lucky because he had access to a single algebra book. What if he had, at a young age, had access to a handheld device that gave him the entire works of all of civilization? Hardy visited him in the hospital when he was dying, and just by way of polite conversation amongst mathematicians, said, oh, I just got out of a taxi cab, and it had the number 1729, which struck me as a very dull number. Srinivasa Ramanujan said, oh, Hardy, no, Hardy, it's a very interesting number. It's the smallest number representable as a sum of two cubes in two different ways. 1 cubed plus 12 cubed, or 9 cubed plus 10 cubed. And now there's actually a whole set of numbers called taxicab numbers because of that. How many such geniuses are being lost because they don't have access to knowledge? I would submit to you that the most fundamental change in human history is upon us, that it is the bio-info-nano revolution, and that we are approaching a singularity, which is variously defined, but I would suggest that the singularity is, in fact, the point at which we are going to have a fundamental shift in the existential relationship between humans and their own artifice. Whether that's our own bioengineering or deep artificial intelligence or whatever it might be, we're going to see that come this century. And if we don't prepare students for that world, then we are remiss. How do we prepare them for that world? I don't claim to know, but I am committed to exploring it. Cushing has now a profound commitment to exploring the educational models that will optimally prepare students. It is more entrepreneurial, I believe, than any secondary school in the country. And we have the best minds advising us. And everything that we develop will be freeware. Our library, as I said, was a very small and incidental consequence of this much broader engagement. And so it was a surprise to me. I expected that we'd get a lot of attention for the things that we're doing. I never thought it would be focused on the library and that it would be cast as, do you like books or do you hate books? Wasn't at all what we were thinking about. We love books and we want to provide millions of them to every student in the world. I would finally conclude that currently, for research purposes, printed books have been surpassed by electronic media and will continue to be surpassed even further. That soon, pleasure and depth reading, aside from those who wish the aesthetic or for particular historical or anachronistic purposes, will be surpassed by the electronic media that will be available. Not quite there yet. And that ultimately, we will see the most universal democratization of the greatest repository in history, all of human knowledge available to every single person in the world in a handheld device. Currently, according to The Economist, 80% of the world has immediate access to a cell phone. That would have been inconceivable 15 years ago. And that's soon going to be the case with all of human knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim. You're not going to pick up the books that you've scattered on the floor here? I guess we'll just leave them to be swept up after the event is over.
Now, a librarian told me that Cushing's library used to be the loneliest place on campus. This was filmed during a school period a couple of
Jim,
days
you
ago.
should speak from the podium.
The librarian told me that Cushing's library used to be the loneliest place on campus. And this was filmed during a class period a couple of days ago. So this is what we're providing with our students. The consoles above are actually interesting because right now we're showing different feeds, but ultimately what we want to do is to tie directly into live real-time research that's being done at labs at Harvard and MIT, and so that they can see the computer modeling through sequences of DNA to try to find cures for cancer and so forth. And if you live in Ashburnham, that sense of being able to be in Ashburnham, but to be immediately connected in real time with research being done 50 miles away in a major university is part of what we want to convey to them, that everything is ubiquitously available to them, even out in the cornfields of Ashburnham. Those are, now there's Wi-Fi, there's deep broadband Wi-Fi throughout the library, and every single chair, comfortable chair that they sit in is also able to be plugged into a computer. We're going through a two-stage process. We've gone from 20,000 to 10,000 books this year. What we did was we offered to the departments, we figured out which 10,000 books had been most used in prior years. We kept those for one more year. And then we offered to department chairs to take whatever books they wanted from the 10,000 that we were redistributing. They did so, whatever they thought was useful still. Many thousands of books went to departments. And then we gave teachers dibs for their personal use. They mostly live in the dormitories, so it lines their shelves in the dormitories. And then what was left, which was just a couple of 3,000 books, we gave away to local public schools and literacy programs. And we built what we hoped was a convivial space. All of this is new, and wanted to entice students and teachers to come there together. Teachers now have to pick up their mail at the new faculty lounge in the library, and so it encourages them to come. And as you saw, we have a cafe that we were going to put into the student union. We decided to put it there instead, the infamous $12,000 cappuccino machine. Well, that's what it costs to have a cappuccino machine that makes 500 a day. And it was going to be in the student union. Instead, we put it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Yes, there's a microphone right in the middle here if you'd like to. That's probably the best.
So I'm a librarian here at BU, and of course we are a research library, so we have different constraints, and the process is going to be different here. We are struggling with the question of online access. We have online access to most of our journals, and books is in a transitional state. But I do know that now, and in 5 years from now, most of our books are going to be physical books, and so people doing serious research in books are going to need to use those. How is your process of more or less eliminating printed books going to prepare your students who come to BU or any other research institution where they're going to need to actually use physical books for their researchers? What kind of signal is it going to send them? How is it going to prepare them for coming to an institution like this?
Well, that's a good question. I would actually disagree with your premise. I don't think that most students, especially at the undergraduate level, in 5 or 10 years are going to be using printed books for most of their research projects. If the question is just, can they find their way around a library, well, I hope you give good tours. If they don't know that already, I assume that they already know what a print library is like by the time they get to Cushing. In a much larger sense, they're going to come far more adept than your other students at understanding the world that they're engaged in. I think that will make them extraordinarily interesting students. They'll have interacted on a monthly basis with Nobel Prize winners and Pulitzer winners and others that we bring to Cushing as part of this program. And I think there'll be some of your most innovative thinkers who can use your electronic technology adeptly.
To lower this a bit, Mr. Tracy, I'm from Northeastern University. I purchase e-books and e-journals. I'm not as idealistic as you about the ubiquity of information. I know what the costs are. Just to give you a for instance for research material, we purchased an encyclopedia of nanotechnology electronically with no perpetual access for it, because that's what people thought would be better. That was $7,500. That's this year. So the print version is $1,500, and the economics of it are a problem. So let me just say to you that Thompson, who you mentioned, we pay $125,000 for Web of Science, and we're in the business of canceling journals just to try to buy some printed books and a few e-books. So I don't know if you want to address that, but budgets are a huge problem.
Oh, I agree. And those costs are going to come down. Those costs are going to come down inevitably and profoundly. Look at the entire spectrum of information technology and software for the last 65 years, and you see declines in cost across the spectrum, profoundly so. And so, yes, we're in the midst of a transition. We also don't have shared platforms yet, and probably the best technology and software provider will not be the one that survives. We'll probably end up with Microsoft instead of Apple, or VHS instead of Betamax, but they will start to settle on a shared platform. There will be competition in that marketplace, and it's going to become infinitesimally costly compared to what it is today.
It's not the platform, it's just that the information's worth something.
Well, the platform is part of the cost, at least from my perspective, because we have to base ourselves in Sony readers as well as Kindles, and now we're trying other things. So I think that is part of the cost for adopters. But I just think it's absolutely inevitable that the cost is going to be negligible for the very things that you're talking about in the very near future.
Jim, I think. Now, I see that a number of you have lined up also to ask some questions. I hope we'll have an opportunity to come back to you in just a moment. I'm aware that time is passing, and we would also like to hear from Professor Rick. So may I call on you, Christopher, to offer some remarks in any way you would find appropriate, and we'll certainly come back to you and give you an opportunity to comment or ask questions in just a few minutes. Thank you, Christopher. Thank you so much for coming.
It was suggested that I talk for 20 minutes or so. Like everybody in the audience, I didn't know exactly what Dr. Tracy was going to say, and I shall address mostly that which he issued in printed form to the alumni, parents, and students of his academy. I think most of the things I will mention will have occurred to people already. For instance, that futurology is always more complicated than simply to suppose that people denied in the past what would soon overtake them. At present, we have a vice president of this country who has a way, not so much with his own words as with other people's words, and is a plagiarist who figures in any serious study of plagiarism. In the old days, we had a vice president who did have his own way with words and would say, you'll remember Danford Quayle saying, the evolution towards democracy in China is irreversible, but that could change. Now, had Dan Quayle been a wit, it would have been a great witticism, like his saying that one word sums up the responsibility of the vice president: to be prepared. Now, these would be good things to say if they were witty, because the first one would be an attack on people who think that they know what the future is in China. It would be a witticism. It is true that there were terrible mistakes in the past, predictions that, as it were, a tank would not work. But there were also a whole series of predictions in the past that were proved true that we've completely forgotten about because they came to nothing. That is, everybody knows that Swift said that certain words would never make it into the English language, and mob was one of them. But there are not many people who can name all the other words that Swift rightly predicted would never make their way into the English language. So these questions of change, as with change with language, tend to ignore all the failures in language. That is, we suppose that all words survive because what we have is surviving words. But if you go back into the Oxford English Dictionary to the words that didn't survive, and if you go back into futurology, you don't find, as is rather optimistically suggested, that people were always saying the technology wouldn't work, and it always did. They were often saying the technology would work, and it didn't. Everybody knew that the blimp or dirigible was the future. They would say, this is the future, and it was not the future. So I'm skeptical about the futurology. I'm skeptical, too, always about speaking as if we are already in the future. The future is here at Cushing. That seems to me to be an Irish way of looking at it. I didn't bring my Kindle to throw it down onto the harsh floor to show how easily it breaks, but that's partly because I don't have one. Though last night my wife's nephew arrived with a Kindle that he had just bought in order to show it to us, and he said, for 99 cents I've been able to download The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. I said, what about the marginal glosses? Not sure about that, he said, which are, of course, an integral part of this work of art. He then opened it up, and it's not in stanzas. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, if you get it for 99 cents on your Kindle, is not in stanzas. It is in paragraphs with no line breaks. Now, of course, so we can swap anecdotes about whether or not books are damaged if you throw. I thought it was rather good how it showed you can throw a book down to the ground and it won't suffer any damage. Indeed, you're perfectly happy that my friend here will be able to take your books away afterwards because they need a dustbin of history, apparently. There's a student who will be happy to have them. But these anecdotes seem to me not basically to get at what is at issue. What Dr. Tracy has said in one of his pieces is this, that few of us in 2009 would choose to return to the time when intergenerational transmission of culture was limited to handwritten texts. There is no moment in human history when intergenerational transmission of culture was limited to handwritten text. There is no such moment. And the notion of culture that incorporates supposes that culture is written only, that there is no culture that is oral culture. I mean, Homer it was not a matter of handwritten text, it was a matter of traditions where what was understood to be knowledge was held to be distinguishable from many other valuable things. One of the things I find most unpersuasive in the account is the way in which information is held to be the same as data, which is held to be the same as knowledge, which is held to be the same as culture. Now, it's not just that we need nuances here, we need a fundamental recognition of the difference between a timetable for catching a Greyhound bus and what it is to read the book of Job. If we open that up and say, I'm not talking about depth reading, which is apparently going to be treated quite differently, and I'm not talking about pleasure reading. Of course, I was against the NEA when it refused to suppose that people could read in class with pleasure, though they were not reading for pleasure. That is, the with pleasure is just as important as the for pleasure world, and to separate off research from other kinds of reading is an extremely damaging discontinuity. I'm not talking about historical discontinuity, I'm talking about the discontinuity of any one of our experiences. It's very, very unfortunate to think of fact-finding as entirely discontinuous from imaginative engagement with experiences of our own and imagined. I also find the whole prospect totally unrealistic. When Dr. Tracy says, I can, by simply a button, I can have everything that's ever been said about Churchill. Now, what do you do with it? Where do you find the time to quiz seriously everything that has ever been said? You've got it in the palm of your hand. The problem is not having it in the palm of your hand, it's having it in your head and in your heart and in your intelligence and in your imagination. I'm in favor of information, but I think that Tennyson was right when he said knowledge comes, but wisdom lingers. And we go beyond that now and say information comes, but knowledge lingers. Data come, if you don't mind my still using it as a plural. All right, data comes. No, please. Data come, but information lingers. I agree about the processes that are to be described. I don't think that culture means always yielding to some inevitability that is invoked. That is, you cannot buck a mega trend, is the line. I think that one of the aims of education is, of course, to teach people to resist the propensities of their age and their culture to tyrannize over them. And those propensities change from time to time. I don't know how to, in a way, to begin to argue in detail with this. I think that Dr. Tracy has committed himself to two quite different statements. One says, I'm sorry, the light is so bad here, be assured that books in all formats will continue to abound at Cushing. Above all, it's important to know that Cushing Academy is not going bookless. But then what did it mean to say, we have decided to be bookless within a year? This is not the Globe. These are two statements made within a matter of months. Now, you can, of course, say by book I mean sometimes printed book and sometimes don't mean printed book. But it is not really the case that a book that is not printed is interchangeable with exactly the same text when it appears on a screen. So I have a great many difficulties with this. I believe exactly what Dr. Tracy says when he says that he personally loves books. I'm sorry this light is so bad here. He will say, for instance, I am an incurable bibliophile and fan of the aesthetics, not sure about that word, that are that are distinctive to the experience of reading a printed book. Distinctive to the experience of reading a printed book. We need to know more about that. And that is a very, very important admission. I believe that it is sincere. I don't believe that the implications of it, the corollary of it, are thought through at all in the documents that Dr. Tracy has issued, or in this particular distinction. We need time for questions. I've got a lot here. What I had to do was prepare for anything that might come up, because like you, I didn't know exactly what was going to come up today. When I see books, I see outdated technology like scrolls before books. No library got rid of its scrolls when books came along, though one famous library did get rid of a second folio of Shakespeare because it had the first, and it assumed that the second was an improvement. Not a good idea. When I see Kindle, I see scrolls. Kindle is much, in fact, what you have, there's an instruction to scroll. That is an admission in this machinery that it functions as a scroll does. And there are all kinds of ways in which that act is actually retrograde. Far from being an advance, it is retrograde. The conveniences of the printed book are gigantic. I don't know why it's absurd to talk about electricity. Apparently, anybody who mentions that you might be short of electricity, I can assure you that we know that computers don't let you down. They let you down all the time. I'm married to a graphic designer, and every day something freezes, something doesn't do this, the airport doesn't work, everything electronic. You can say, well, you have batteries, but do you have batteries? Last night we were trying to play, we needed a battery, and fortunately somebody happened to have about his person 2 batteries of exactly the right size. But it is simply not true that these considerations are absolutely beside the point. It is a very vulnerable medium. The electronic media are regularly vulnerable, I think. So these are the kinds of case I'd want to make. I'm just going to end with 2 things. I have not taking up my 20 minutes because people want to say things. 2 things. One is that I think that a perfectly honourable aspect of this, which Dr. Tracy keeps coming back to, is the identity and the nature of his academy. That is, we see this as a model for the 21st century school, and it's going to be a very distinctive feature of Cushing Academy that is doing this. Now, that, of course, has to do with something wonderful that has happened, for which a great price has been paid. Every university and every school, and I know many people who teach in private and public schools in Massachusetts and elsewhere, every institution has an identity crisis in this sense, that diversity within every institution has led to less diversity of institutions. It's a perfectly simple thing. Every capital city in the world is more like every capital city than was the case when I was young, because every capital city is now diverse. You can get English cooking, which as we know is the greatest in the world, in pretty well every capital city of the world. We have experienced an extraordinary increase in diversity and an extraordinary diminution of diversity, because every university, every Oxford and Cambridge college that used to be characterized by exclusive stiffnesses which had a disagreeable side, and specializations or convictions that had, for which a price was paid. Keble is the Oxford movement, and if you're in sympathy with those convictions, that is where you went. Jesus College is where you went if you were Welsh, and so on. They had an identity, they were open to the objection they were not diverse, and what you had was a huge diversity of institutions. I'm not saying which of these two is to be preferred, I'm simply saying that life being tragic as well as comic, you choose one, you do not get the other. Institutions are more and more like one another, and if I was the headmaster of a school or the president of this university, I would seek some distinctive stamp, do you know what I mean, to characterize it with an identity. I don't think this is a dishonorable motive, but I think it is clearly one of the impulses behind this choice made by Cushing Academy. Dr. Tracy points out, I'm not sure what this half president was. I'm not sure whether it's been like being a half man or for only half of the tenure under whom he has served here. Well, he's mentioned the present president, and I'm glad that he has. I want to just end with some words from the previous president, who tends not actually ever to get mentioned by name, I notice, on these occasions. That is Dr. Silber. And Dr. Silber has expressed, I think, very powerfully what some of us feel about this particular decision by the former head of the Boston University Academy. Books are not obsolete. They're still one of the finest inventions ever made. Students already spend more time than is ideal staring at computer screens and the displays of electronic devices, and much of the material they access that way is somewhere between ephemeral entertainment and outright lies. Books have a heft and authority that the internet does not reliably possess, and so on. There's a reason that students with comfortable dorms study in libraries. They can clear away distractions and focus on their work. If they're expected to read on their laptops, they will always have ready access to the internet, their email, Facebook, YouTube, and the like. This is rather like starting an exercise program with a bag of chips set on the treadmill. And books, as forms of human communication, cannot necessarily be reduced to the text they contain. The key thing on this is Nicholson Baker, who has pointed out you get it on Kindle, fine, except you lose any legible map, any legible statistic. All this, we're told, will be improved in the course of time. Then let us wait till it is improved in the course of time and avail ourselves of it then. Sometime or other, this material is going to be very cheap, become very cheap, so let's hang in there. Predictions about the end of this century are not going to be made by me, for one thing, because I should be dead in 12 and a half years' time, and for another, because it doesn't cost you anything to make this prediction. By the end of the 21st century, you won't have any books. How can you ever be caught out in an assertion of that kind? When the electricity goes out, the computer library is not even virtual, it's passé. I don't think that John Silber is a fool in bringing up the question of whether or not this is dependent repeatedly on very large external sources. If you were in a totalitarian country, you'd be much safer with books in many respects than anything electronic. China can clamp down pretty quickly on whether or not electronic things are usable. The book, to extirpate every copy of a book is terrifically difficult. To shut down these large systems is not terrifically difficult, though I'm not myself somebody who thinks it can happen. Why would anyone want to engage in the destruction of a library? Dr. Tracy would say he's not engaging in its destruction, but he is making distinctions between things that, though they are distinguishable, are not distinct. The idea that research is distinct from depth and is distinct from pleasure reading. I think these ideas are deeply mistaken. They are the ideas of Babel. What is proposed at the end is something by which everybody in the world will have in the palm of his hand, or her hand, enough to allow him to access all the information that there has ever been. I think that that can't work. George Steiner, who is not without apocalyptic largenesses, George Steiner has a book called After Babel. Geoffrey Hill, hearing the book, said, "Another of those hoped-for titles."
Thank you so much, Christopher. You honor us, as always, with your comments. We're so grateful. Now, Victor, why don't you come up and join me? You have a sense of what our schedule is for the afternoon. We've reached the hour of 2:30 when we thought we would bring this session to an end. Would you like to take some time for some more questions or comments?
I think we should take some time for some questions. Let me just ask the people who are doing the filming, if we are at around 20 minutes before the hour, can we finish up some questions while you set up New York?
Yes, because they have to do a test.
Okay, great. So we can. So you just tell us when it's time that we really need to.
We were supposed to test between quarter till or whatever.
Okay. Richard Sarnoff will be appearing from New York in his office in Manhattan. I did get one question for Dr. Tracy from the that was sent to me on the internet. Actually, if you want to send it to me to blues@bu.edu, it's much easier than to me to go to blues@bu, which is my personal email, than APUE, which is difficult to get. Anyway, and that is, what is the acquisition? I mean, the model for downloading? Is it a Google model, or is it another kind of Amazon model, or what is it? And how much did you work out a deal with them, price wise, or how does that work?
Could I also just respond to Christopher for a
I would
moment?
like to take some questions though before we do that, because
Okay.
they'll probably come back to you anyway.
Yeah, so let's make some time for
Sure.
some others as well.
I don't myself know the details of the model for downloading. I'm not a technician. We just hired, actually, we expanded the number of librarians incidentally. And the Boston Globe reported that we replaced a circulation desk with a cafe. They chose to ignore the fact that that was because we were building a much larger circulation desk, much more central to the library, and we hired more librarians, because our feeling is, as Christopher rightly points out, that with all of this information, the challenge, of course, is to how do you effectively guide students through this vast landscape of information overload. And so we actually have more librarians. And the person we just hired has a tremendous background in information library science that is electronic, and I don't know all the details. He's working all that stuff out.
Oh, okay, thank you. Dr. Ricks probably could say this better than me, but I just wanted to ask you about, goodness, okay, so it seems to me that over time your library and your staff has built a collection that is built to serve your community, and you've thrown that away. And you keep saying that you have access to millions of books, but that may not be better than that particular collection that is built to serve your community. And it seems that you've made yourself vulnerable to a few digital content providers that could, turn the switch. We joke about electricity, but they can, the story about, Amazon has to remove the book. Yeah, so that could happen easily. And I think the questions of totalitarianism actually are a good one. And then when I look at your library, I worry about just a lot of noise, a lot of distraction, classrooms competing with each other, blaring TVs. It doesn't seem like a quiet, reflective place. It seems like it would be difficult to get work done there. And also the cost. I think it's legitimate. You said that we have a 3-year cycle of replacing Kindles, and it seems like that's going to be very expensive over time to maintain that. You're going to have to throw away that Kindle in your pocket and buy a Nook, if you like, or something else. So So the cost, noise, distraction, and making yourself vulnerable to a few digital providers. Those are my 3 questions.
Well, thank you. In terms of cost, I would just point out that I'm holding in my hand something that costs about $400, and it has more computing power than something that would have cost millions of dollars 25 years ago. So again, we very clearly decided as a school that we're going to jump ahead. We knew it would be a bumpy road. We knew that not all the technology was there yet. We're actually working with the corporations, and I can't go into details, but I can tell you that we have signed a non-disclosure agreement with Amazon so that we can share with them feedback about what the Kindles need to have in the next generation, and they can share with us what's in their laboratories now, so that we can help as a school. Our students are engaging with Amazon and the teachers to help them shape the next generations, the next iterations of Kindles for better use. We're also a beta tester now for the Kurzweil e-reader. And so we're working with these companies, and that's precisely what we set ourselves to do. I believe, as Christopher does, that there's a value to a multiplicity of models, including institutional and educational models. And we have decided to define ourselves within a certain core competency. In terms of distractions, one thing you didn't see in the video is that we have 2 significant rooms that are off-center there that are entirely quiet. Also, at the carols that you saw, we have Bose headphones that squelch noise. Students will put them on. Interestingly, in terms of distractions, which Dr. Silber mentioned, and had a nice conversation with John yesterday, actually, where he basically yelled at me, and then felt like old times. And I said, "It's nice to hear your voice again, John," which I meant. I love John. But I didn't expect John to agree with me on this. In terms of distractions, the department at our school that is most excited about this actually is the department that I mentioned, the academic support program that focuses on students with learning differences. And that department chair feels that the electronic approach to information, to reading and so forth, is going to help her students enormously because it will allow them to highly individualize their approach to the information and to web it in distinctive ways so that it would be much more malleable for them and for their needs. I would also say in terms of privacy that is an issue that I did have written down and didn't get to. I think that is a major problem in terms of potential totalitarianism and so forth, but that's a much broader construct. I mean, how many of you are exclusively paper in all of your most personal transactions, financial and otherwise? That's a problem that's much larger than the question of somebody finding out what you're reading. They also can find out what you're searching on the internet, and I don't begin to have a solution to that. I do think that it's valuable to allow students to have subversive ideas. As John Maynard Keynes said, a young man who isn't a Marxist has no heart. A middle-aged man who's still a Marxist has no brain. And so I think that it's important for young students to be able to indulge their subversive tastes and not feel that somebody's watching them. I think that human ingenuity will actually always find those like lacunae within the technology, and the students are more adept with it than I ever will be.
Let's just go to another question.
I'm puzzled by how dismissive you were to our librarian when he asked about the students finding their way around the library, because you had said that when you were a doctoral student, it took you an hour or maybe over an hour to find a book in the library. Secondly, I wonder about what I've read, and now you reinforced it, that one of the factors in your decision was that the students didn't check out books. You said you were told it was the loneliest place on campus. I have to say, were I anywhere on that campus, even were I picking up papers for money, cleaning the trash, I would feel it was my responsibility to make sure the library hadn't been the loneliest place on campus.
Well, I hear that from a lot of people, and I've heard so many people say, well, then Cushing wasn't doing its job. And I say, you're not looking. Students, Robert Darnton in his piece at Princeton said that the library is grossly underutilized. It's one of the loneliest places to that effect. I'm trying to be honest here, and I simply don't see people's claim that there is A, sanctity about the printed book versus the electronic book, or B, the claim that students are really utilizing the library. I keep hearing from people, gee, at my school,
No, I
they're utilizing
understand
the
that,
library.
but why I have made students for their go get books. I teach them how to use the library. They go to the library and they use it. It's less lonely for them if they're all going. That's what I don't understand. I'm not saying it's not true.
I'd say go to almost any high school in the country today.
No Commonwealth school. No Commonwealth school.
Basil?
So you can find outliers.
Dr. Tracy, I have a question about a rather fundamental concept, the bottom line, or what to you and the rest of the administrators at Cushing Academy is the bottom line with this experiment. Are you perhaps looking at standardized test scores, feedback from parents, feedback from the professors themselves? How do you measure the success of this program?
Well, there could be many metrics to measure success. I'd say one is that students tell us they're reading more. Teachers say that the students are more engaged in the learning experience, and we have more tools for the students. It's not just the use of books either. I would say that information certainly is pleasurable and can be a depth experience. I was in the library at one of our whiteboards with George Leeson from Oxford University, and he was discussing his research on aging and how there is and is not sometimes a correlation between affluence and longevity. And Dr. Shields, who's one of our historians, got up and started tinkering with the console, and before I knew it, right behind me was a graph that he had pulled down from a website, and he had put the data points in, and on the y-axis was longevity, and on the x-axis was wealth, and there were many bubbles of different colors that represented countries. The size of the bubble represented population, and he began in 1960 and it counted down to 2007, and we were able to watch graphically as the United States shifted way out there in terms of wealth, but did not dramatically increase in its longevity, whereas you saw some European countries increase in longevity, but not go very far out there in terms of wealth, and other countries decline in Africa and so forth in both categories. And you were able to get a lot of information there that the students then examined for about an hour with the professor from Oxford. I think it was one of the most in-depth, engaged learning experiences I've ever had with secondary level students. And it was all done in a way that you could not have accessed that information so instantaneously from a book.
Okay, I'm going to have to take, we are very, very pressed for time because of the people in New York waiting. So we will take 2 questions, but we'll just do 1 minute each if that's okay. Thank you very much.
I'm a student here at BU, and I have just a very simple question. I've read that reading by computer can escalate sleeping problems for people with even the most minute insomniac issues, and also taking into account that the majority of information provided online is very short articles that are meant to provide quick information to its viewers. I was wondering how, considering all of that, staring at a computer screen and reading by computer light for so many long, extensive hours for reading a novel or fiction of some kind would affect or strain your eyesight in any way, or maybe cause headaches or not allow someone to sleep.
Well, again, I fundamentally disagree with Christopher on one thing, and that is I think you can delineate different types of access to information. And so our decision was about the research purposes, and most of that is not reading an entire book-length piece. And what we're doing is we're buying into databases that give them much more depth than the types of short blurbs that they might find on their own just by Googling something. The other thing is that we, for their more extensive reading, are providing Kindles and Sony readers and Kurzweil readers that are available for circulation, and we will download anything that they ask onto those. Now, we started with 18 because the point of this was research. We have many, many books all over campus, and it is not, incidentally, my comment about books being antiquated was actually specifically in the context of for research purposes, and it was taken out of context by the Globe. I don't think that we're there yet in terms of the, as I said, in terms of the Kindles being able to completely replace printed books. We offer both platforms. We started off with 18. Every student has a laptop for research purposes. We started off with 18 that could circulate. By the time we're in our second day, we had to buy 50 more. And we're now up to 200, and I think by the end of the year, we'll have one for every student on campus.
Okay, our last question.
As regards to the library thing, I just don't know if it's altogether a problem that a library is a lonely place. Well, that's one. But anyway, I come from a humanistic perspective, so particularly from a literary perspective, and I gather that you do as well, given that you referenced the Tempest and Faust and Huxley and so on and so forth. But I was just wondering if you might speak to what Shelley once commented in A Defense of Poetry when he talked about more difficult pleasures in life and how, once you were done with shallow pleasures, you would pursue more difficult ones more often. If you would think, a student with a laptop and a reader and so on, and who could rent those out of a library, would ever really get through, the 5,000 or 6,000 lines in Hamlet or the Iliad or the Odyssey, or even a medium-length poem like Song of Myself or something like that by Whitman. So if you would buy that wager that a student with all of those distractions would ever complete that reading, or if they would, read a concordance for research or Spark Notes. So it's more of an abstract argument rather than a logistical or political
I think it's a very, very important argument, and I couldn't more profoundly or fundamentally agree with that concern. I think it has nothing to do with whether they're holding a Kindle or a printed book. I think the distractions and the lack of depth reading by students today has nothing to do with whether it's a Kindle or a printed book. It's much, much larger and much more systemic. Personally, it's funny you mention that. I just finished reading Hamlet on my Kindle. I enjoyed it enormously.
Okay, we don't have time, but there'll be time later on at the reception where you can certainly ask questions and be able to have a much longer follow-up. We'd like to thank James Tracy and Chris Rick.